Coming up next, we will air a news conference held by representatives of the Libertarian Party responding to the drug summit held in Colombia. Ron Paul, a former Libertarian Party presidential candidate, announced the formation of a coalition to end drug violence, which would push to decriminalize drugs.
Good afternoon. My name is Nick Dunbar, Director for the Libertarian Party. It's my pleasure to introduce you Dr. Ron Paul, who's Honorary Chairman of the Coalition to End Drug Violence, an organization committed to ending drug violence. We'll be holding a drug peace summit later on this summer. Also speaking will be Dr. Nancy Lord, a candidate for mayor in D.C. She's proposed model legislation to end the violence associated with drug use. And thank you for coming.
Thank you, Nick, and it's nice to be here, and I welcome the press today. We all know that yesterday the President was in Colombia holding a summit on drugs. Yesterday, the Libertarian Party put a full-page ad in El Tiempo, a newspaper in Colombia that went to 250,000 people. This full-page ad took a position in contrast to what the administration has been taking. We believe that the drug problem is made much worse by our laws, and that the whole drug war is a hoax, has not done any good, and has made the problem much, much worse. It's been going on for many years now, and all the fanfare and all the talk and all the money being spent on the war on drugs will prove to be futile. The ad basically said that we can compare the prohibition of drugs today to the prohibition of alcohol. Once alcohol was prohibited from the free market, it went into the underground, and alcoholic consumption did not go down. Matter of fact, it went up. The quality of alcohol went down, and alcohol-related deaths went up. The ad, of course, was in Spanish. This is a copy of the full-page ad. We have a copy here today of the English translation of this particular ad. Our position as libertarians is that we have a very serious problem in this country. It's a serious drug problem. But it's a medical problem and it's a social problem. And that it cannot be solved with the military, it cannot be solved with the police, and it cannot be solved with the courts. And ever since 1914, when the drug laws came into existence in this country, we have done nothing but make the problem much worse. At that particular time, there was a move on to make alcohol illegal. There was a period of time when prohibition existed in this country, but the problems were made much, much worse, and we see that same thing happening with drugs today. We do not deny that there's a drug problem, but we are emphatic in saying that the drug problem is a health and social problem, and it cannot be solved with more guns and more government violence and more prisons. This is not the solution. The solution is in education. The solution is teaching people that the use of drugs is not good for them. Today, under educational programs, we see the decreased number of people using tobacco substances, and we see the introduction in alcoholic beverages such as low-concentrated beer and wines, which has been done voluntarily. When substances are made illegal, both when alcohol was illegal as well as when the drugs, hard drugs, have been made illegal, there is a move toward more concentrated, more dangerous, more contaminated drugs, and that is why we see an unconscionable number of drug deaths that would be unnecessary if drugs were made legal. It is very important that the point is made that the obvious reason why we want to change the laws is to stop the violence. Today, because there's such profits in drugs, there's this tremendous emphasis on making money off the drugs. Today, because there is such a tremendous incentive, we can't even keep drugs out of the prisons. We could turn the country into a police state and we couldn't keep the drugs out because all it would do is build up the incentive. Things are starting to change. We are starting to see people who are reflecting the position that the Libertarians have taken for years. And for this reason, we are now asking for a coalition of individuals and groups to come together and meet by the end of summer to end drug violence. Anybody who's willing to talk about changing the laws, we want to bring them together. We are not having a meeting of only libertarians who say that the only thing you can do is totally decriminalize, but to bring together groups of people who will at least listen to the reasons why the laws have not worked. And when you look at what's happening in this country today, it is pretty clear that the ice is starting to crack. We've been leaning on it for a long time, but the ice is cracking, and individuals who have respect in the community are coming forth and suggesting that drug legalization may provide an answer. When you think of the former Secretary of State, George Shultz, coming out and admitting that he fought 2 drug wars, one under Nixon and one under Reagan, and he said they were failure, that we ought to reassess this. I think it's time the American people woke up and decided to reassess the drug laws. We don't always have moderates, liberals, or conservatives taking these positions, or libertarians, because we see a conservative like Bill Buckley talking about legalization and drugs. We see the mayor of Baltimore talking about legalization of drugs, and several noted professors in the country who can defend their position in a very intellectual manner. So the time is right. The time is right for us to come together and start seriously talking about the repeal of prohibition. If we care about our children, if we care about the drug violence, if we care about the muggings that are going on in the street, it's time we decided that the prohibition of drugs has not worked and that this very serious problem can be dealt with. But if you look at this problem in context of what's really going on, possibly the problem isn't nearly as bad as some would have us believe. For instance, we lose 350,000 people a year in tobacco-related deaths. Probably it's close to 6,000 or 7,000 from drugs. And these would be reduced if the drugs were made legal, and certainly we would reduce the crime deaths that are occurring on the streets for people fighting over the turfs on who will get to sell the drugs. So it is a time in our history that I think we should come together and start being more rational about it. Alcoholic deaths, there's 125 to 150,000, but because it's socially acceptable, nobody says anything. And because we knew that prohibition of alcohol was a total failure, it has now been accepted that everybody can drink alcohol and it's not a big problem. Well, it is a big problem. Drugs are a problem, but in relationship to the other deaths, it is a much greater problem. That is, the alcohol and tobacco is a much greater problem. Can you imagine what the people of this country would think if a foreign nation who happened to have religious and political beliefs that tobacco was bad and it was banned to come to this country and decide to root out the tobacco plantations in this country? To root out the tobacco and burn the fields and plow them under? I mean, that is the rationale of us going and spending tens of billions of dollars around the world trying to eradicate drugs, and it will have nothing to do. They've been doing this for years, and it has nothing to do with the results. We need to teach people that drugs are bad and get them to decrease the demand. This can only be done in a free society through persuasion, never through the coercive, violent hand of government. You cannot solve the problem of drug violence with more violence. That is why we're calling for this coalition to end drug violence. And the meeting, again, will be held at the end of the summer to bring as many people together who share these views. Thank you very much. Open for any questions. Also, Nancy Lord, who is here with me, is also willing to take any questions on the local nature since she's a candidate for the mayor of Washington. Okay, let me introduce Nancy and let her go over briefly the legislation that she has outlined and what it does.
Members of the press, thank you very much. The legislation that I'm proposing is based on the New York Alcohol Beverage Control Act, which was initiated when alcohol prohibition was ended. It would require that people who sell drugs or who import them be licensed. It would require that no drugs be sold to anyone under 21 years of age. It would encourage the use of warnings, which would describe the ill effects of drugs, possibly by regulation, possibly by strict liability for any problem that is not mentioned in the warnings. It would prohibit volume discounting. This means that every seller would have one price for all of his product. This way, people would not have incentive to purchase more than they need or to bring their friends with them and encourage other people to use drugs. Through the use of this legislation, we could keep the drugs out of the hands of more young people than today. Today, young people are being pulled into an illegal and malignant criminal enterprise. Why? Because the dealers are afraid that if they allow an adult to work for them, that adult, if he is caught, will have to turn them in to avoid going to jail, while a young person faces less of a sentence. So the kids are being dragged into this by the time they're 12 years old. They never have a chance to pursue legitimate opportunities. This legislation, if enacted, would end all that. It would end the violence. Last year, 438 people were killed on Washington streets. And this year, we are rapidly approaching the same total. Over 70 people have been killed so far. Police are dying in a futile effort to end this plague on our country. And my belief is that regulation and legalization is a better means of putting this problem into perspective and getting a handle on it. When the people of Eastern Europe look to our country, will they see a shining city on the hill, a center of commerce and enterprise, or will they see SWAT teams and yellow crime scene tape? Let's get this country back on its feet. Let's stop diffusing resources and capital into a futile war on drugs that is not only not helping, it is making things worse. Thank you very much.
Any questions? I have one answer of a question that's asked me the most frequently. Last night I was on a radio talk show, and as usual, the question came up, does it not mean that if you legalize drugs that you endorse the use of drugs? Doesn't this send a bad message? That's probably the question we get most frequently and probably the most challenging, because the last thing that I, as a physician and as a parent and a grandparent, would want to ever send is a message that there's something good and decent and logical about the use of drugs. But I compare it to the First Amendment. We all work very diligently to protect the First Amendment. We realize that the First Amendment even protects those individuals who do and say and write things that we disagree with. Who in the world would ever say that we must do away with the First Amendment because people write things that we disagree with or practice religions that we don't agree with? At the same sense that we should protect voluntary private behavior. We legalize private voluntary behavior because it's a principle of freedom, because they do things, individuals do things that we might disagree with. In no way do we endorse it, no more than we would endorse what people do and say under the First Amendment. And I think that is a legitimate answer. I think it's a clear answer, and in no way does it send a message that we want to see further use of drugs, because there's nobody that wants that. What we want to do, of course, is address a serious problem that has gotten much worse over these past 20, 30 years.
I would also like to add to that. I think that these people who say that drug use is going to go way up are talking nonsense. I've met with the drug warriors. I've met Rudolph Giuliani. I've met Reggie Walton. And when all their arguments are finished, they all come down to the same thing, the moral message. We all need the strong hand of government to tell us that drugs are wrong, or we're going to run out into the streets and start using crack. Well, I find that insulting, and I think it should be insulting to all of you. As Dr. Paul was saying, making something legal is not endorsing it. There are plenty of things that are legal in this country that we do not endorse. People who don't use drugs because they know that drugs are bad for them. That is why drug use is declining in terms of the casual user, because people are learning that using drugs is crazy, and we are perfectly capable of learning that for ourselves. It's funny, when you ask the drug warriors, Would they go out and use crack if it was made legal? Each and every one of them will deny it. It's always the other guy, someone not quite as smart as they are, who needs to be told by the government to stay away from drugs. Well, I say it's time we tell them no. We don't need this. We don't need children being killed in the street so the government can tell us no. We are capable of making our own decisions.
One other point I'd like to emphasize, I mentioned very briefly in my opening remarks, and that is this change in law, the legalization of drugs, the decriminalization of drugs seems very, very strange to most Americans. I think most of them, when they listen to it and reason about it, they come in our direction, they start saying, you know, that does make a lot of sense. But one thing that they fail to realize is that most of our history, drugs were legal. Up until 1914, up to the Harrison Act, drugs were legal. There was cocaine in Coca-Cola. And we weren't a nation of druggies, and we weren't a nation of prescription drugs. We weren't a nation of tranquilizers, a nation of alcohol. So there is a problem, but the problem has nothing to do with the lack of laws. And I think if people will stop and realize that if America existed when it was a freer nation and more concerned about individual liberty, was able to exist, just possibly we could do it again. Any questions from the audience? If not, I believe we could conclude the press conference.
You made a statement that drug use was not on the increase because you talked to the drug lords.
Yes, the statistics show when you compare the NIDA data, that's the National Institute of Drug Abuse, between 1985 and 1988, drug use overall has gone down dramatically. The number of people who use cocaine occasionally went down from like 6 million to 4 million. However, the regular use of drugs, which would include crack, has gone up. The use of all drugs went down from 23 million to 14 million. This would be the weekend marijuana user, the people who use drugs occasionally. That has dropped. So what we've done with the drug laws has been trade the weekend marijuana smoker for the crack addict. We're getting more addicts while we're getting fewer people who use drugs casually. Now, I'm not saying reducing casual use is a bad thing. I think it's a very good thing. But again, I don't think it's a result of drug prohibition. I think that people are learning that drugs are bad for them. Obviously, prohibition is doing nothing to stop the addicted user. These statistics also show that not everybody who tries crack becomes an addict. If you compare the number of people who've tried it to the number of people who are addicts, it's only a small fraction.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Good job. Thanks.
Okay, on the ad. Okay, more. Make sure I have it upright. Okay. Thank you.
That concludes this news conference held to respond to the Cartagena Drug Summit. For more information, please write to the Libertarian Party. The address is 1528 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20003. Coming up next, a discussion of the possible reunification of Germany.